Hello and welcome to Need to Know Introduction to British Cultural Studies. This is a series of videos that gives you an overview of British cultural studies, and I will explain some key concepts and key theories, and we will also talk about some thinkers and some examples. For those in my tutorial at TU Dresden, it is basically the weekly summary of what we talk about in the tutorial. Let's delve into number 1, Culturalism into Cultural Studies. Let us first look into the traditions of studying culture. First, the culture and civilization tradition. Here, what is culture is basically seen as what is civilized and what is good. And Matthew Arnold says it as culture as the best that has been thought and said. So an ideal or the basically incorporation of perfection and how you should live. This is, however, not democratic, but a very elitist view of culture. Now the question, who is that elite? It is usually people from Europe. For example, if you think colonialism, people from Europe go somewhere and see themselves as better, and because of that impose their rights and rules on other people, and also according to social status. So within European countries, in our case, for example, Britain, usually people with a high social status, so wealthy people, lords, people who had education, they defined what is seen as civilized and good, and other people, the uncivilized masses, were seen as not ideal. Those others were not civilized in terms of knowledge, in terms of values, and in terms of rituals. This doesn't mean that everybody should see them as not civilized, but this was the view of the culture and civilization tradition. An elite saw themselves as cultured and civilized, and others as uncivilized masses. What is also important here is the notion of popular culture. So new forms of media at the time of the tradition, so in the beginning 20th century, for example, radio, and then later also film. Basically, what is consumed by the masses. This is also seen as very uncivilized and very threatening in a way. So we can say that the result of this tradition is that there is one culture considered as ideal, and everybody who lives differently is seen as uncivilized. And then the people who are uncivilized, so usually the masses, the working class, and also the new developments and influences that change the existing culture and the existing traditions, so like US popular culture or industry, they are seen as a threat to this elitist culture. So it's very traditional and conventionalized view, and it is very exclusionary. The second important tradition is culturalism. It is a more recent tradition than culture and civilization, and it basically relates to culture as textual forms and documented practices of a society. This means, at one hand, texts in the written sense, but also everything else that can document the practices of a society. So, ranging from photographs, films, works of art, paintings, also to, if you take it in a very broad sense, objects that are produced in a society and because of that are related to how people live in a certain society. So basically, culture is here seen as everything that is related to the way of life of the people in a society. It is also a very democratic view of culture because, as I just said, it relates to everything that is related to the way of life and not only to a certain ideal way of life that is defined by an elite. And according to culturalism, if you study culture in the textual forms and objects, it is possible to reconstitute at one hand the patterned behavior of the people, on the other hand, the constellations of ideas in the society. This means at one hand, you can, from the object or text, reconstitute what values did those people have, what rituals and what practices were prevalent in the society, and also how did people view themselves, what was their conception of who am I and how am I living, the habitus in a way, a very distinct form of living life centered on the self. We will look at that when we look at Bourdieu, which is not the topic of today. And also the discursive formations, which basically are the organization of knowledge in society, in a given society. So this is basically possible to access through the textual forms and objects that we can view, which are made by a culture. Culturalism also highlights human agency, so that culture is not only something stable and something that is imposed by an elite, but something that is actively produced whenever people just live, basically. Whatever people do in their everyday lives produces, in a way, culture. And the result is that no longer the best that has been thought and said is culture, but just everything that is or has been thought and said, and also is or has been done, is part of culture and is also very much linked to the context of its emergence. So there are different cultures at the same time. Let's now take a look at 4 key thinkers in cultural studies. Those writers at different points in time studied culture and also attempted to define it. This slide summarizes the key arguments of the definitions of culture by each of the scholars, and you may want to take a moment and pause the video so that you can read through the notes. As you may have noticed, Matthew Arnold and F.R. Leavis belong to the culture and civilization tradition. They view culture as something perfect and something ideal that shouldn't change, and if it changes or is threatened to be changed, then there is a threat, either by the working class or by also the American popular culture. Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams not only belong to the tradition of culturalism, but more or less invented it. So their books, The Uses of Literacy and The Long Revolution, basically are a significant contribution to the changed view on culture in academia and can basically be seen as the starting point of what we study as British Cultural Studies today. We will now take a closer look at Raymond Williams and his definitions of culture. Raymond Williams proposes 3 important categories to the definition of culture. The first one is the ideal. This means culture is perfection, or its universal values. And it is basically in line with what the culture and civilization traditions thinks, and yeah, that's why I put Arnold there again. The second general category is the documentary record. Here, culture is basically the, quote, body of intellectual and imaginative work in which human thought and experience are variously recorded. In simple terms, how culture as the social practices of a community or society can be recorded. For example, pictures, photographs, videos, and also written texts, and more. Basically, everything that is produced out of the way of life of a society in this kind of artifacts or texts. The third and very important definition is the social definition of culture. Here, culture is seen as a particular life of a society or community which expresses meanings and values not only in art and learning, but also in institutions, in behavior, and also in basically their way of life and what is produced out of it. So this is basically the anthropological idea behind it. Culture is the way of life of a people which is different from other groups' way of life, and which can be accessed through the documentary record. And in certain senses, there are ideals which are imposed upon somebody. But in general, the second both are the most important for our cultural studies. What is also important are structures of feeling. And we will look into that later, because first I have a slide which summarizes those categories in different words and also gives some examples. Again, you may want to pause the video for a moment to read through the descriptions and examples. The descriptions are basically just other words for what I explained just before, so maybe the examples are more important for you. Let's now have a look at structures of feeling. This is basically the answer to the question, how do people perceive their reality? Reality in quotation marks here, because what structures of feeling states is that affect, so just the immediate reactions, and also cognitive processes, your whole way of thinking, is linked to the cultural context. If you grow up in a certain society, then the concepts you have for perceiving and describing the world are not natural, but cultural, because this is just what you know, what you have learned. So in a way, the reality you perceive is mediated by what you know. And this however, is belong to culture. So these structures of feeling are basically these structures and organizations or concepts which people have in their minds to access the world, to feel the world or to perceive the world. And those can be values, those can be concepts in the sense of what does a house look like, for example. Also practices. For example, how does one put things on the table in order to make it look orderly, or how does one greet people? So you have conventionalized rituals, practices, behaviors that in a way mediate how you perceive the world. And basically, you can say the way people think and behave is linked to culture and then inscribed in the documentary record of culture, because what people do in their everyday lives, how they behave, how they speak, also how they write, this then again produces things within culture, and this is the documentary record, and this is how cultural studies can access also past cultures. In the study of a culture which is not your own, either because it is just somewhere else on the planet or because it is somewhere in history, you have one problem, which is called selective tradition. It basically means that the artifacts and texts from past times also, which you can access, are never the complete picture. There's always something missing. And so whatever you can analyze is always just clues to these structures of feeling. And you have to be very careful to not forget that it's only clues and you never have the full picture. But why is that so? Well, we have different processes of selection. One is that materials just get destroyed, not by intention, but just because of natural catastrophes, war, simply forgetting about them, or also because, for example, the paper a letter is written on just rots away, and then at some point it doesn't exist anymore. I wrote there some examples to illustrate what this could mean. I think it's quite straightforward. What also happens is that cultures at later points destroy artifacts. So nations trying to rewrite history and make some documents just go away because they don't fit the official truth anymore. Also, censorship is very important here. So basically, what is transmitted over time is always in danger of being in a way destroyed by later cultures as well. And then what we also have is a very selective perspective ourselves. So if a story gets told, it's always one perspective. But if we are trying to analyze culture, it's also always through our own perception. We can never completely get rid of the way we think, because this is the way we think. And this is also the way we access our world. So our own structures of feeling influence how we see the world and also how we analyze culture. And these are some important points which need to be taken into account when studying culture. The next two slides will give you some context of schools of thought and key thinkers. Schools of thought basically are either institutionalized groups or theoretically coherent groups of thinkers. Institutionalized means that at a certain point of time in one university, for example, a group or institute focused on one research object and then very decisively contributed to how this field is seen. Key thinkers are then those scholars who really significantly contributed to a certain field. This example here, the people you can see up there, are the Frankfurt School, or some members of the Frankfurt School. They are mainly two generations of thinkers and some further influenced thinkers. So in a way, the Frankfurt School is an example for both. An institutionalized school of thought because it derives from an institution or an institute in Frankfurt, but there are also influenced thinkers, and so you have some kind of theoretical coherence throughout the time. Those are the first generation and the second generation of thinkers. So whenever you see or read one of these names, you can think Frankfurt School, that's where they belong. And they also have influence on contemporary researchers and scholars. The main argument of the Frankfurt School is critical theory, and they basically criticized capitalism, mass culture, and analyzed power structures, always with this critical intention. And they also looked into ideology and its link to cultural production. So basically, how can mass culture strengthen existing power relations and inequalities in society? So one statement here would be cultural reproduction. Um, this just as some context on the Frankfurt School. Who is more important for cultural studies, however, are the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the University of Birmingham, founded in 1964. The group or institute is no longer existing because it was at some point incorporated into the Sociological Institute, but this is basically the cradle of cultural studies as we do it today. They really decisively influenced how culture is studied, especially in the British context. They were a group of scholars at Birmingham University, and the directors of the institute were Richard Hoggart, we have already come across him, Stuart Hall, whom we will come across during the next lectures, and also Richard Johnson. There were some other members, importantly also several female scholars, which was a novelty at the time, and also in a way emphasizes the very forward-thinking character of the group. Their main arguments are basically several approaches to the study of culture as a social practice. It is also the Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies is very much indebted to the culturalism tradition and just really explores this new way of studying culture. It is highly influenced by the New Left and Marxist tradition in thinking, and it studies the interplay of culture as a social practice and also power and inequality in society. It takes a special look at the hegemonic common sense of media, which reproduces existing hierarchies. So basically, how does media, what is produced as culture in a way reproduce the existing hierarchies, and how can we also, and this is very important, change that? There is a critical perspective, and the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies wants to contribute to societal change by criticizing, by looking at inequalities, by working interdisciplinary and drawing together all the findings in order to really change something in society. So now let us draw everything together and have a look at what does British Cultural Studies do. So first things, what do we study? Cultural texts. So basically the documentary record, and because it's British Cultural Studies, mainly in the British context. What are perspectives and approaches? We link text to the socio-historical context and analyze and interpret it. So we have a content, but also a form aspect. We also analyze how things are represented. And then we have certain categorizations and theories which relate to content and form, and also to perspectives like power, identity, and the construction of a social reality. We have some problems which are related to the selective tradition. And then also the question, why does it matter? And so cultural studies really tries to be a critical examination of social reality and tries to question the norm, to think twice, so to say, to look at exclusions in society and where they come from. And also, most importantly, how can this critical perspective upon what is today and what was in the past really improve and change society? This picture is a short application task for you, and you may want to pause the video and think about the picture in the sense of culturalism and the culture and civilization tradition. If you have done so, you might have thought about some of the following aspects. This is a boathouse, so a workshop where boats were repaired and manufactured. So it definitely belongs to a working class aspect and also a working class tradition. This is not how boats are manufactured in contemporary times. It is a tradition and it belongs to history. So we can, through this, if we think culturalism, through how the building is made and through the tools which are there, access how people lived and how people worked in a time which is not ours. It, however, also in a way belongs to contemporary times because it's still open, it's still used for something. They also have boat hire here, which means it's also transported into contemporary times, and we can also look at how does it feature in contemporary times, what do people do nowadays, how has this maybe changed. In the sense of culture and civilization, well, this simply wouldn't have been considered culture because it is, after all, working class culture. And so it would have been seen as, well, this is just what the uneducated masses do. Maybe if it were about manufacturing boats for example, boat tours for upper class members, then the boat tours themselves would be considered some aspect of culture, but certainly the boathouse itself would be something that is off and that shouldn't be part of the upper class and elite culture. There are definitely more perspectives you can employ, but this is just some short aspects you could mention when you have the task of describing that picture. Now, this chapter is told, and all that remains to me is say thank you very much for listening and see you next time. Below you can see my sources. And if you feel like I want more content, I want more input on one of the topics, you can either look at the individual sources of the thinkers. My recommendation would, however, be John Story's Introduction to Cultural Theory and Popular Culture, because this is also the book that basically helped me through the beginning of my studies and was very, very helpful. So that may be as a final note. Then, goodbye and have a lovely day.